Welcome back, kids and retards. Today we're going to be reviewing a band that is the truest of the true. We are going way back into the ancient times to arguably the very first sword and sorcery heavy metal band, one of my all-time favorites, and to all those that slay posers with steel, they hold this band as one of their all-time favorites as well, Manilla Road. A name that many think means the road of light. You know, Manilla is kind of a lighter color and it's on a road, so it's like road of light. But Mark said it was pretty much just a bullshit name that they thought of, you know, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath. It was like a name with the color in it. Whatever. Speaking of Mark, he is our main dude, Mark the Shark Shelton, the man that was on every single album. He pretty much is the band, and he was a pretty nice guy that was easy to get along with. What's funny is that this is the last guy you'd expect to make the most crushing power metal riffs, you know. He turned into like a complete pothead hippie grandpa type with a giant Gandalf beard. Last guy you would have ever thought would be the king of US power metal himself. Now I must say there is a big turnoff about this band for many people that makes it harder to get into them. Maybe you may never get into them because of this. But Mark's voice is very odd, I'm not gonna lie. He sounds like an old wizard, but that's kind of the appeal of it, you know. He's that nasally, weird voice, but sometimes he did like cool growls and shit. He was very versatile, and he was actually trained classically to sing, which is kind of unbelievable to some people that hate his nasally voice. Now, Mark was also the guitar player and principal songwriter. Not only was he an underrated vocalist and songwriter, because no one fucking knows about Manilla Road, but he was also a really underrated guitar player. The guy didn't take any lessons, so a lot of his chords were very unorthodox and weird. He knew how to read and write music, but when it came to guitar playing, he taught himself everything. And he got to points with his lead playing that was unfucking believable. Some even classical runs from just his own discipline and training. So Mark was enlisted in the Marines for a while, then he got out and was hanging with a couple dudes that would eventually turn into some of the early lineups of Manilla Road.
Started the band in 1977 with Ben Munkers, Scott Park, and Robert Park, and myself. And went through lots of band member changes real quick.
But when it came to his actual first official recording lineup, he got Scott Park on bass and Rick Fisher on drums. Now, before we talk about the first album, Invasion, I'm going to school all you Manilla Road fans out there. We're going to talk about After Midnight Live.
After Midnight Live that came out, it was actually recorded live in a radio station. But it was in a studio, but it was still a live performance that was aired on the radio at the time we were playing it. And that one came out, you know, many years later after we found some of the old tapes.
Prepare to get schooled. After Midnight Live was actually, you could argue, the very first Manilla Road album, because they went into some radio station nearby and they played their entire album, and they say on the recording that this is supposed to be their first album. But as many of you know, none of these songs are even the songs on Invasion. I mean, they might sort of be, but like reworked. I didn't notice it though, to be honest. But it's completely different songs. Honestly, I don't know why they threw this one under the bus. It's still kind of unexplained to this day why they kept saying in that radio station that this is going to be their first album, and then out of fucking nowhere, a year later, they release their first album that's nothing like any of this. It's definitely not one of my favorite releases from them, but it's definitely underrated, overlooked even by the Manilla Road diehards. Hardly anyone knows about it, so I'd say check it out and maybe even regard it as their first album. It is pretty cool. But let's move on to the actual first album, Invasion.
It was pretty much self-produced, and we pressed it ourselves. We created our own record label, Roadster Records, to put it out, and did all of our own distribution ourselves. And It was tough. It was hard getting things going, but the reason we did it ourselves was we sent demos to every record label in the world at that point. Nobody could care less. They didn't want us.
Now, a big change that they had with this album when it came to After Midnight Live was this was really the true beginnings of sword and sorcery metal. I mean, look at that goddamn album cover. It's literally a sword with sorcery all around it. I mean, come on. Now, I must say, though, that me and many other Manilla Road fans, we really like this early era. I mean, fuck, Manilla Road has never released a weak song or album because they're awesome. And they have, like, how many goddamn albums? But these early albums are definitely 70s style metal, even though they're released in the 80s. Now, if you're not into that, like, really raw early 80s, early 70s production style, then you're also probably going to hate this band and never get into them, like, at all, unless you're open-minded in some ways, because everything they've done had a really cool raw production to it. But, man, these early albums compared to the classic era and onwards, this really sounds like 70s metal, but more so 70s than actual metal. But there's some heavy, cool riffage on here for sure. I mean, there's the cool progressive, The Empire, which they played all the time live. You had Cat and Mouse, and then my favorite song is the riffin', cool, almost speed metal song, Street Jammer.
I'm a street jammer. Street jammer.
But once again, before we move on to their next album, official album, they were actually supposed to release a different album. One that was originally supposed to be called Dreams of Eshkatan, but then it was pretty much thrown away to make the album metal. But many fans had found the demos and bootlegs of it, and they loved it, and they're like, release this shit. So years and years and years later, in like the 2000s, after being pestered about it forever, Mark finally released it.
The guys at Monster Records bugged me for 10 years trying to get me to agree to release this. I told them no, year after year after year.
He was consistent.
Until about 10 years later, and I finally said, look, Dennis, you guys have bugged me consistently year after year to put this out. You know, stop calling me, just let's do it. Let's go ahead and do it because you've been so adamant about it. I got to give you a thumbs up for just being determined. And so we went ahead and put it out, and lo and behold, it became a really popular thing. Dreams of Eshkatan was the original title for this, but there's actually 3 extra songs on this too that weren't on the original album, which is Time Trap, Venusian Sea, and Aftershock. Those were actually a demo that we recorded after we recorded the album. And I think when we were sending out demo tapes, we sent out cassettes that had all of the Dreams of Eshkatan on it, plus those 3 demo songs. And eventually I think everybody started just calling it the Mark of the Beast demo because it had the song Mark of the Beast on it. It seemed like that was one of the most popular songs off of it as a demo.
The first release of it was actually called Mark of the Beast, but then they re-released it again as Dreams of Eshkatan. Now, I consider this Mark of the Beast. The album cover is way better on Mark of the Beast than Dreams of Eshkatan. I don't give a fuck. Mark of the Beast is also a cooler name, and it's the opening track. One of the coolest songs, and I must say, this is the most 70s, arguably maybe even 60s sounding album they even put out. But for some reason of this early material, it's actually my favorite. And I could see why Mark didn't release this, because it's very psychedelic and proggy in areas. When you listen to Metal, the next actual studio album, it's totally trying to go for more of a rock and hard edge direction. With this, it's very spacey, space rock even in certain elements. And it's also one of their longest albums. I mean, goddamn, you have so many epics on here, like Court of Avalon, Mark of the Beast, and my favorite of the epics, Avatar, because it has a beautiful intro, but then it comes in with the most kick-ass, riffy, almost prog metal chorus.
Avatar, Avatar, we cry again. Avatar, Avatar, we die.
But don't worry, if you're not into that weird spacey prog shit, there are some cool rockin' tunes on here. And once you get to like Black Lotus, you're pretty much good till the end. I'm glad that Mark released this album though, because it is my favorite of the early ones, and I know some people that even say that this is their best album of all time. If you're into the cool, chill the fuck out, melodic, psychedelic stuff, this is an album you have to check out. Now, metal, despite its title, still has much more 70s than metal. I'd say it's much more hard rockin' than metal, but it was harder than what Mark of the Beast turned into. But I gotta fucking say, man, this album's biggest issue is its sound. Now, I like raw production and all, but when the bass and drums and vocals all sound way louder than the guitars, it starts to not fucking sound like metal, which is the whole name of the album. If you're gonna call your album metal, like, what the fuck? And that album cover, I know some people that really defend it and say how cool it is because it's just, you know, metal, the word metal. But I prefer the re-release cover where it's like metal on like a giant cliffside shit. It's way cooler. You have Far Side of the Sun, which is a shorter version of the same song on Invasion. I prefer this version because, you know me, I like my shit condensed and get to the fucking point. But you have some other really great tracks on here, my favorite being Queen of the Black Coast.
Take me back across the sea. A fire, yeah, to my queen.
And they almost broke out. They got a song called Flaming Metal Systems, which was put on a compilation, and they almost got signed to a label for it.
That helped us get a contract with Mike Barney from Shrapnel Records, who put us on the U.S. Metal Volume 3 compilation album. And that's when I wrote a song specifically for that album, which was Flaming Metal Systems. Mike Barney actually wanted to sign us for the next release, which would have been this one. Well, I already had this one in the can. I went out to California and met with him and played him the tape for it and everything. And what he told me was that he really loved the intro, the prologue, you know, that comes right before Necropolis. He loved that. He thought it sounded great. And he said, but the rest of the album sucks. I just don't really like it at all. I don't care for it at all. And he said, but I tell you what, if you just don't even worry about this album and go back home, write an album and record an album that's pretty much just Flaming Metal Systems all the way through the album. And I'll sign you right now if you promise to do that. And I basically told him no way.
Crystal, magic, crystal, magic.
Now, a big misconception about this classic album, fan favorite album, is that this is the beginning of what Manilla Road would sound like. Now, I agree that it's the beginning of the classic era of like their best albums, but let's be honest here, this is still pretty soft and commercial for how they would turn into. I mean, goddamn, they didn't turn into like straight up grindcore or anything like that, but the true Manilla Road sound definitely had harder, more heavier riffs, where a lot of this was kind of commercial, traditional metal sound, you know, almost like the new wave of British heavy metal in tone. There's definitely moments on here that are heavy and show what Manilla Road would turn into, but to me, this is almost like the in-between point of the early Manilla Road not knowing what they're doing and the Manilla Road that would continue till the end. But boy, for an outlier, does this album stand the fuck out. There's so many classics on here. I mean, goddamn, the album starts with their most classic song that's been covered by how many true metal bands to this day, like Visigoth and Cauldron. This song, although has the most nasally vocals in existence, is one of the all-time greatest opening tracks of all time, Necropolis. Now, before we get into the song, though, I gotta say, let's be honest here, has anyone else ever noticed that Flaming Metal Systems, that single that almost got them success, the vocal melody in that sounds identical to the vocal melody in Necropolis.
Beware, the shrapnel flies, flaming through the night. This night, tonight. It feels like I'm living inside a dream, but my mind tells me I'm lost in the Necropolis. Lost in the Necropolis.
You have so many other catchy tunes on here, Feeling Free Again, The Rill Master, The Ram. But like I said, they did have moments where they were showing where they're about to go. Not only with heavy riffs, but epic moments. You, of course, had the title track, which is a rockin' heavy tune, But the last song in here is weird because you think that they would have a song Dreams of Eshkatan on the Dreams of Eshkatan demo, you know? But of course they had to be one of those annoying bands that release title tracks on albums later down the fucking road. You need to stop doing that, by the way.
I was so into the concept of the Dreams of Eshkatan concept that since we didn't put out that album, I decided just to condense it down to one song.
Okay.
And so that's how that song came about.
Dreams of Eshkatan is an incredible epic that at first starts very dreamy, like the Mark of the Beast stuff and the early material, but then it gets really fucking heavy and crushing. A song that's about nuclear warfare. Now, if you're wondering what album to start with this band, I don't know if I would recommend Crystal Logic as the beginning, because if you're really into the new wave of British heavy metal traditional, stay true, stay catchy vibe, I'd say start here. But if you're looking much more for an album that represents them, I would maybe not start here, because it's not as heavy and as epic as they would turn out to be. Because I'll be honest, the first album I heard from Manilla Road was Crystal Logic, and I was turned off by how nasally the vocals in Necropolis were. It wasn't until I listened to the next album that I finally get into Manilla Road.
This turned out to be a really great release for us too. We finally got signed by a European label, had good distribution for this, and it sold extremely well. It sold better than Crystal Logic had.
Now, Open the Gates truly is the beginning of Manilla Road as we know it, as they would continue to be, unless they're of course messing around with other styles, but this is them as tried and true as possible. Now, they'd finally gotten fucking signed to a label known as Black Dragon Records, which would end up being a black mark on their lives. And they also got an international distribution going on, and those would kind of go at each other's heads in a little bit here, but we'll get to that. Now, they also got a different drummer, Randy Fox, because their last drummer, Rick Fisher, he was really starting to not like this heavy direction they were going, so thank God they got rid of him and brought in Randy Fox.
And we auditioned him for about 1 minute.
And then
I heard him play. I said, do something double kick, because Rick wasn't very adept at doing double kick stuff, and I said do something with double kicks in it, and he whipped off a thing that eventually ended up being the intro for Heavy Metal to the World. And I heard that, and I said, okay, you're hard, come on.
He actually ended up being one of the most technical drummers I've ever heard on an album. Holy shit, he's going crazy on this album, but that's nothing compared to where they'd keep going, because during this era they kept getting heavier and heavier and heavier. You have a lot of really crushing heavy songs in here like Metal Strum, Open the Gates. You have some catchier stuff like Astronomica, which is more like the last album. Then you have some really bizarre shit. The weirdest song in here being the Ninth Wave, a damn near 10-minute epic that sounds a lot like Saxon's The Eagle Has Landed, but probably better. And I love Saxon, so that's saying a lot. This song is very space rock influenced. It sounds like a spiraling epic staircase that just keeps going and going and going. It's easily the most epic song ever created.
Rise from the sea.
Now, although there's a lot of cool rockin' songs in here and whatnot, my favorite song might actually be the final track in the album, which is one of the other longest songs in here, the final epic, Witch's Brew. Starts out beautiful, but of course in Manilla Road fashion turns into the absolute most crushing riff on the entire album.
Would you drink a witch's blood? Blood of wisdom shed by you.
Now, even though this album was like my favorite for the longest time, nowadays it hasn't aged as well on me, not because of this album's fault. I'm just very picky with whatever my favorite album is. I want something that gets my attention, keeps it, but doesn't go on too long. This album's biggest issue with me is that it's like 50 minutes, and I want my Manilla Road albums to be more to the point. And boy, oh boy, do they nail everything I want on the next album.
In my mind, The Deluge is, out of the first run of albums that we did, this was the first one that I was just proud of every single aspect of.
Now, The Deluge is not only mine, but it was one of Mark Shelton's all-time favorite Manilla Road albums because he felt that this was finally where they perfected everything and the sound and all of it. It sounded like them live. That's what he really liked. Fuck, I mean, I'm even wearing the shirt for the album. Thanks to Shadow Kingdom Records. Go buy their shirts. They got a lot of great shit. Anyways, so this is my all-time favorite Manilla Road album because of so many reasons. I mean, the heavy crushing riffs, the epic songs on here. The length of the album is short and sweet, and mother of fucking God, the drumming from Randy Fox is incredible. I mean, listen to this shit.
On the depths of the ocean, beneath the spawn of the deep, from the wrath of Poseidon, fragments from the sea.
Mark even said that at this point in the band, and from this point on, they kept getting heavier and heavier and heavier, getting into the ridiculous territory. It was like him and Randy trying to outdo each other. This is the golden era of the band for sure, and to me, this is their absolute apex album. Now, it took me a while to get this album because it's sandwiched in between an album that was my first favorite for them, a much heavier, more speed metal album, and then it's sandwiched in between, of course, the beginning of their classic sound with Open the Gates. So to me, it felt kind of unnecessary until I really started to listen to it. I'm like, if you ignore those two other albums, this one really, really, really just stands out because of the songs alone. But man, you have so many short, catchy songs on here, especially when my all-time favorite's Hammer the Witches. I love the crazy, harsh vocals that Mark starts throwing in the mix with this album, especially in the next couple ones. He really does some like cool, crazy witch growls in the chorus of that. I love that shit. And some of these songs like this one are really, really short, but once you get to the end of the album, you have two epic songs in a row to end it off. You, of course, have the title track. Then you have my favorite, maybe all-time Manilla Road song, Friction in Mass. Not only are the riffs crushing, the melodic section's great, but the best part of the song is when you get to the end. It feels like a complete journey. Once you get to that end, and it just keeps swelling upward and upward and upward and getting more epic, and they just keep throwing in more instrumentation and shit. I mean, this is one of the creepiest sections I've ever heard in a metal song, and it really makes you think that they must put a lot of fucking work into this album. So that's it for that album. Get the Deluge or I'll beat the fuck out of you. That's all I gotta say. Now, like I said, Mystification was my first favorite Manilla Road album. Open the Gates caught my attention. I liked it. It was the first one I liked. Then I went right to this one, and I was blown clean the fuck away. This is really the album I latched onto. For a while, it was the only one I listened to because it was the only one I kind of got, but then eventually I got everything else because it's Manilla Road and they're fucking awesome. But what really drew me in about this album is I'm just listening to these albums, right? You know, traditional metal, then you get speed fucking metal. What the hell? And then some of Mark's vocals on here are growly as hell. Some of the most crushing riffs I've ever heard. God damn. I love Manilla Road album covers, but what the fuck is that album cover? I could never figure out what the hell is going on there. There's of course the other re-release album cover that they had, which is also very cool, but I don't know which one I prefer. They both work. They're both really awesome. And like I said, this has some of the most classic crushing songs, making this one of my 3 all-time favorite Manilla Road albums. It always circulates. You got this one, Crystal Logic, and of course the Deluge. At the moment, my favorite's the Deluge, but fuck, it could be Mystification the next day, easily. And it opens with Haunted Palace, Spirits of the Dead, god damn. And then of course you have the song that everyone talks about, Mask of the Red Death. They played it all the time live, but honestly, it's not one of my favorites on here. My favorite might be between... Shit, it gets difficult. It really does. There's so many good ones. Either the ending track or, on some versions, the opening track, Up from the Crypt. Some of the vocals on there are very haunting, and that riff.
All the dead shall live and rise up from the
Now, during all this chaos, you do have something kind of unusual. 2 slow songs in the album. You have Dragon Star, which is a cool ballad that actually took me a while to get into. And then you also have the title track, which is easily one of the most classic songs. It's super melodic, and Mark's singing on it is very, very good. But despite this being such a killer album that you think would keep getting them traction, because at this point they're selling pretty decently for being an underground act that finally has a label, the label unintentionally fucked them over.
Black Dragon sort of started hitting a hard time over there in France, the label we were signed to. And they lost their distribution in the States. Their distributor that they were using in Europe got shut down by the French government. And the next thing you knew, they had no distribution and no
That's
clout.
pretty serious when the government shuts you down.
Yeah, well, I think it was like some illegal things they had done in business trade things
Gotcha.
or whatever. Anyway, we got caught in the crossfire of all that. In the meantime, the label had lost their distribution in the States because they pissed Important Records off, and so Important Records wouldn't even have anything to do with us.
So it sold like ass. It did absolutely nothing for them until they re-released it, and it sold very well. So to try to get out of this predicament, they signed on to Leviathan Records, which was owned by David Chastain. As many of you true metalers know, he's the guy that runs the band Chastain, that has one of the all-time greatest female vocalists. But we'll get to them some other time, hopefully. So he tried as hard as he could in multiple ways to make sure that they got international distribution, but it was getting hard for them at this point. The next couple albums definitely sold better than Mystification, but they weren't even doing as well as the Deluge or Crystal Logic or even Open the Gates. So then they put out their next album, Out of the Abyss.
And then let's see, we had Out of the Abyss next, which was probably, a lot of people considered it a thrash album.
You heard right, folks. Thrash metal Manilla Road. Now, Mark tried to deny that this is a thrash metal album. He said, oh, there's thrash elements, but there's still some, like, epic heavy metal. I mean, there's 3 songs that aren't thrash metal, but most of the album is thrash metal. So to me, it's a thrash fucking album, and it is a killer thrash album. The vocals on here are incredible. The drumming is ridiculously fast and technical. And, of course, the goddamn crushing riffs. Of course, I have the title track, Black Cauldron Slaughterhouse. I mean, come on. My favorite has to be the opening track, the decently lengthy one, too, and probably the most crushing, fast, rip your fucking head off song on here, Whitechapel, not to be confused with the Posers' Whitechapel. We're talking about this Whitechapel.
It's the blood before my eyes, bringing newborn life to this tortured mind.
But Mark is right to say there's a couple moments on here that aren't thrash. Of course, you have War in Heaven, which has very odd progressive time signatures in the opening of the song. They have Return of the Old Ones, which gets kind of thrashy later on. And my favorite song on here, along with Whitechapel, the ending track, which is definitely an epic heavy metal song that keeps chugging along and chugging along. Definitely in the vein of the earlier and somewhat later stuff. You have Helicopter. And then they put out Live Roadkill, which is a great live album. Their only live album, technically, other than After Midnight, which was released way after the fact because they found, you know, the tapes of it and whatnot. So they had to release it because it was awesome. But this Live Roadkill It's ridiculous. I mean, goddamn, Mark and Randy are like trying to outdo each other in how fast they can play. It's ridiculous. If you're not into speed and thrash metal, avoid this album at all costs, because goddamn, it's insane. But then shit starts to get kind of weird.
At that time, the metal industry was going, you know, and we were spent with Out of the Abyss. We spent $20,000 recording that album. You know, because we recorded some of it in Wichita, and then we went to California and worked with Steve Fontano and recorded a little bit there and did the mix there. And so we spent just lots of money on that album, and we just sort of broke even on it. We just made it back. So we were looking for ways with the market dying to still be able to afford to record and maybe make some money, you know, doing it. And so the idea was, you know, Randy would program the drums. And we actually sampled his drum set, you know. So it's his drums on there. It's the sound of his drums, and even his cymbals and everything.
For the very first time, Manilla Road had a production that was actually pretty good and sounded like it was 80s, although it's the year 1990. Now, for some reason, they decided to try their luck once again with Black Dragon Records, and David Chastain tried helping them get international distribution once again. So he tried convincing their international distributors back when they were with Black Dragon, before they got blackballed, to release this album internationally under Manilla Road. But they kept bitching and bitching about it, but they came to a weird agreement.
Chastain tried to get this released as Manilla Road over here, and because he was still involved with us after the Out of the Abyss, because that was on his label. And what ended up happening was Black Dragon put it out as Manilla Road, and David got Important Records to agree to releasing it as long as it didn't say Manilla Road on it, as long as it just had my name on it.
If you own one of the versions of Courts of Chaos with the Mark Shelton label instead of Manilla Road, boy, you own the holy grail of metal albums. Now, this album is kind of all over the place in the styles. You have thrashy moments on here, songs like Dig Me No Grave and Vlad the Impaler, great songs, but then you have stuff that's more epic metal, like The Prophecy, and you have really bizarre shit, like their cover of DOA, which I think stands for Dead or Alive, or Dead on Arrival, or Don't Over 8. I don't fucking know. Anyways, this song is very weird, but I'm not gonna lie, I kind of like it.
We were looking for a cover version to do of something, and none of us could agree on the song until we finally agreed on DOA, because it was...
It had keyboards in it.
Yeah,
and Randy loves to play keyboards.
Loved to try and play keyboards and drums at the same time.
Phenomenal.
And it was one song that we could actually do that way.
But you know what's the absolute weirdest thing about this album? Not the drum machines, not the fact that it was released as a Mark Shelton album, but the fact that the best goddamn song on here, The Book of Skelos, was released as a bonus track on some versions. What the fuck? I mean, if you're gonna cut a song, cut the cover of DOA. Honestly. What the fuck were they thinking?
Books of Skelos was not written for Courts of Chaos. It was written and recorded during the Out of the Abyss sessions. And the label boss, David Chastain, who owned Leviathan Records, he's the one that cut the song off the album. Because, I don't know, something about sacrificing babies or something didn't appeal to him, I guess.
So then the lineup kind of fell apart, signaling the end of the early days of Manilla Road.
You know, Scott was really bad into drugs and alcohol. Randy wasn't, and
they clashed.
And they clashed, and they couldn't do anything together. They didn't even want to be in a studio together.
As a matter of fact,
you know?
the Courts of Chaos album, we recorded that whole album without Randy and Scott being together in the studio.
At any given time.
It was obvious it was time for us to hang it up for a little bit. And I formed a band called Circus Maximus. Well, I got a deal with Black Dragon again for it, and at the last minute they decided that it should be a Manilla Road album because it would sell better than a band that had a
Typical record label trick.
And so it came out as, and I really didn't want it to happen that way. It really upset the other two guys in the band.
This ended up pissing off the other members, and even though they toured for the album for a while, it was just never the same. This is the only album they ever did, only tour they ever did. And you know, for the longest time I hated this album and ignored it as a Manilla Road album. And I continue to kind of not say it's Manilla Road. Because it has the name, fuck it, we'll talk about it. And you know what? I've grown to love this album. You have a completely different lineup on here. You have Aaron Brown on drums, who also did some of the album covers for them back in the day. And then you have Andrew Cross on bass, and all of them do vocals on this album. And Andrew Cross actually does the most amount of the vocals. So a lot of people were like, what the fuck is this? Where's Mark? But I gotta say, man, Andrew Cross is an incredible fucking singer. I'm surprised how many times I listened to it, just getting drawn back to his vocals. Honestly, making this a standout if you consider it a Manilla Road album because of those incredible vocals.
No one seems to care for the lost and lonely ones. Out of sight is out of mind. Still I wait for more this war and race. Can't see into the dark.
But honestly, it's one of the most unique albums Mark ever did. He thinks it was one of his best guitar playing albums, and I gotta agree, his guitar work on it's wild. Then you have In Gein We Trust, which is a doom metal song, which I believe is about Ed Gein, you know, the murderer that they based so many horror movies off of. And then you have a really bizarre one, Hack It Off, which has like rapping in it and shit. I actually like that one quite a lot.
So here you are, lift your head, you've been on the dawn, turning like you're so right now, I'm puppet on a string, you're the thing. Under you, you rise like coiled diamonds of pride. You make my bed, I'm waiting to you. What can I do?
Then you have songs like Forbidden Zone, which has vocals from Mark, which is one of their most classic songs. Honestly, if you hate it and you keep giving it a chance, does nothing for you, don't count it. But don't knock it till you try it. Now, it was a very long gap before Manilla Road had actually put out another album. It took the early 2000s for them to do it, but they did reunite in the mid-90s and try to get something to happen with Randy Fox, and they tried to get another guy on bass named Harvey Patrick, who's the brother but would eventually end up being the singer from Manilla Road when Mark's voice went to shit. Then Mark continued trying to be creative, making another band called the Mark Shelton Project, but they kept continuing touring as Manilla Road, doing dates here and there. But the lineup all fell apart when they did the Bang Your Head Festival in the early 2000s.
Anyway, we got invited to do the Bang Your Head Festival in 2000. I asked Randy if he was interested in doing it, and I brought Mark Anderson into the thing saying, hey, can you do the bass work? And they were all on board and everything, so I told them, yeah, we're in. We booked the show and everything. And then a few days later, Randy decided he didn't want to do it. And that ended up being a problem between him and I for a lot of years.
He couldn't do it because of his new job. He didn't think he would have enough time because he worked for the aircraft company. And the aircraft company, you know, industry, you don't get a lot of time off. You're there, you're punching the clock, you know, and if you're not there, you're fired, you know, you're gone. And, you know, and he was married and starting a family and stuff, so his job was important to him. And so we kindly said, you know, hey, we understand where you're at, but we can't let this opportunity go by. We can't cancel. You know, that's one thing that Manilla Road, up until recently, we've never had to really cancel a show.
Now, Randy and Mark eventually worked out these differences, and Randy would make guest appearances with Manilla Road all the time during live performances, but he never returned for a full album, which always pissed me off because he was my favorite drummer. They were slowly weaning in a new vocalist, Brian Patrick, to try to take on some of the vocals because Mark was having some issues at the time.
I developed chronic laryngitis in 1984 when we were doing the Open the Gates album, and I went through these vocal treatments, you know, where they were injecting me with steroids and stuff, and doing all sorts of stuff to my body to revive my vocals. And when I got through with all the treatments, I had this insanely
High voice.
falsetto. And so since I discovered I had that, I started using it a lot. And obviously I abused it as well because during one of the Circus Maximus shows in Wichita, I let out a really super high scream and then actually tore one of my vocal cords doing it.
He still did live vocals occasionally, and some points he did full vocals on albums or half the vocals, so we still got Mark around doing vocals, so that's cool. And this guy sang very similar to Mark's style.
This was originally going to be the Shark Project, but instead we decided, okay, well, it does sound, we were handing out demo tapes of this all over the place when we were in Europe. And I got lots of offers for it, but everybody wanted it to be Manilla Road.
Okay.
And I was okay with that at that point because this sounded enough like Manilla Road. I didn't care, you know. It's like, okay, well, this can pass as a Manilla Road album.
Now this is another concept album that Mark spent a lot of time writing. It's a concept about like all different types of gods and goddesses and shit like that. He like wrote stories of his own based on some of those characters. It's very over the top. Where did he come up with this shit, man?
Well, I smoke a lot of marijuana, so that's probably how it came up. I don't really drink much anymore, so I guess I gotta blame the weed.
And back when Manilla Road was trying to make something happen back during like the Randy Fox era in the 90s, they had actually built their own recording studio, but never really did anything with it until now. This whole album was recorded in their own recording studio, and they did plenty of other stuff in that studio as well. Now, to most fans, this is one of their lesser favorite albums, because I don't know, it's kind of just a quick comeback, you know, it's not really well thought out, it's not classic, but it is still very, very good and consistent. I do like it quite a lot. It has some really crushing riffs on there, my favorite being the appropriately titled Decimation. But one really cool, unique thing about this album is that this is one of the few newer era Manilla Road albums that mostly features Mark Shelton on vocals. I believe Brian only sang a couple songs on here. Now, after Atlantis Rising, Manilla Road put out 3 more albums in a row that were classic Manilla Road. Many fans, including myself, consider them to be some of their all-time best albums, and they finally returned with being creative and extremely memorable. We have the first of these, Spiral Castle. I know many people that consider Spiral Castle to be the all-time greatest Manilla Road album, and what's interesting about this one is that it delves a little bit into doom metal, and not as much as people claim it does, but there's elements of it for sure. Now on this one, Brian does more of the vocals, but it's very hard to tell the difference of who's doing the vocals because they both sing in such a similar manner. Now back when Randy Fox was in the band, back when they're building their studio, back when they're fighting about recording these songs with the real drums or not, there were a couple songs they did write for a Manilla Road reunion that never happened. They're actually used on this album. I think that is a big reason why this album has such a classic feel to it while also changing things up again. It really feels like it was the sequel to Out of the Abyss. You have a lot of really good songs on here, crushing riffs as usual, Spiral Castle, Shadow. Then you have the very doom metal-esque song on here with some of the more crushing riffs they've ever written. I know, crushing riffs, da-da-da-da-da-da, you know. But this one, goddamn. This is easily the best song on the album, one of their best ever. Arguably the best song they've ever put out in the 2000s, Merchants of Death. Then we got more lineup changes, and to be very clear, although there's quite a lot of lineups in Manilla Road's history, pretty much all of them happened over good terms, except maybe the Randy Fox falling out. But we got a new lineup here. You got the new drummer, Corey Christener, and then you have Harvey Patrick who's Brian Patrick's brother, if you guys remember, coming back to play bass guitar. And then we have the second of the classic 2000s Manilla Road albums, Gates of Fire. Now, Gates of Fire is very unique. You have 3 different concepts on this album. 3 songs in a row make each concept album, so you got 9 songs on here.
One of the concepts is about the fall of Troy, or Ilium, based on Virgil's writings instead of Homer, like everybody always bases it on Virgil was a Roman poet that told the same story, but not the same exact way, more from a Roman and a Greek point, or Roman point of view than a Greek point of view. And so there was that. Also I'm a huge fan of Robert E. Howard, creator of Conan, and Solomon Kane, lots of other cool stuff. And we did a Conan thing from the Frost Giant's Daughter story. And so that was one of the other concepts. And then we also did the stand of Leonidas and the 300 Spartans and their cohorts at the Battle of Thermopylae.
Now, there's a lot of great material on here. It's very hard to pick favorite songs, but I gotta say, I love the way it opens with Riddle of Steel. That's some of their most awesome, catchy, classic Manilla Road stuff, and it really does feel like it came out straight from like the Deluge era. And then we got another lineup change. This time, the vocalist Brian had to leave for a little bit. He was having a lot of personal issues. So they continued with the same lineup without Brian as a 3-piece now, just like Manilla Road used to be back in the day. And I gotta say, man, of these 3 classic 2000s era albums, this one is easily the best. And I would say I'd hold it up there with my 3 other favorites. And maybe the more I listen to it, honestly, it might be my all-time favorite Manilla Road album.
For some reason, without Brian on board, I really almost went into like a death metal phase.
What? What the fuck?
You people heard right, death fucking metal on a Manilla Road album. Now, it's not a full-on death metal album. I'm not going to argue about it like Out of the Abyss, where that one's definitely a full-on thrash album for the most part. This one has some songs on there that are death metal and have death metal riffage for sure. It is easily the heaviest album they've ever done, but it also has some of their most softest, well-written, psychedelic, beautiful songs they've ever done, which is harking back to, say, the Mark of the Beast era, with incredible epic songs like Tree of Life. But boy, I ain't here for Tree of Life. I'm here to get stomped the fuck out by the heavy, crushing songs. My favorites being, of course, Conquest, which is the heaviest one there. My favorite is the Blood Eagle, which, if you don't know, the Blood Eagle was a rumored Viking method of torture where they would like rip your fucking back parts of your rib cage out and have them out like wings and shit. It's pretty gross.
Death and honor, drive them onward, out of Iceland, butchers.
Well, what's weird is I see a lot of people bitching about the death metal vocals, which is weird because they don't bitch about the nasally normal vocals from Mark, but they're here to bitch about the death metal vocals from Mark, which just sound like him doing his normal vocals but kind of growling more. It's like him doing an old Viking and then a fighting warrior Viking. Like, come on. Stop being a fucking poser, it's fine. Now we got more fucking lineup changes. Brian comes back to do vocals. Then you have Vince Goldman coming in to do bass to replace Brian's brother Harvey. But then when they were in the studio recording the new album, Playground of the Damned, he had some personal issues.
He developed what they call Meniere's disease, which is a problem with your inner ear and your eardrum, and it messes with your equilibrium. And the thing that messes with you the most is loud noises. What a terrible thing to have for a heavy metal musician. And so he basically had to hang it up. He couldn't tour with us, and he knew that if he couldn't tour with us, he couldn't really be on the albums.
So he only ended up playing on 2 of the songs on here, Art of War and Brethren of the Hammer. Now, I'll be honest with you guys, this one is a very weird album, Playground of the Damned. I don't quite know what to think of it. I do like all of it, but I don't know how much I like of it, because it's very different, very dark, and very weird. It doesn't grab onto you as much as some of their other stuff, but I feel like if I keep hammering the album in, I feel like I'll maybe think it's like one of their better, more unique ones. But boy, is it fucking weird. I know a lot of people that really, really love this one, and people that think it's one of the lesser favorites of theirs. And to me, it's one of my lesser favorites at the moment, but that shouldn't deter you at all. It's out of the ordinary for them, for sure. So I would definitely recommend it no matter what. It's fucking Manilla Road. And you have very cool songs on there like Brethren of the Hammer. Classic, classic fucking song. Totally about the fan base.
Together, united metal brothers stand and fight as one, true to the oath of blood.
Then shit got retarded again when Corey had to leave the drums. Then they got a new bass player, Josh Castillo, and they got a German dude, his nickname was Neudi, to play drums, who's a longtime fan of the band.
He actually made the very first Manilla Road website and ran it for us.
That's some trivia.
Yeah, ran it for us for an awful long time and did a great job on it. And we became friends through the internet. I met him in 2000 in Germany. We became fast friends then. And he had done this tribute to Randy Fox drum solo thing that he had sent us and everything, and it was great. And when I ended up with a situation where Corey wasn't going to be able to tour anymore, and we'd already booked some shows. One of them was the Hammer of Doom for 2011. I was like, well, my goodness, we're just going to have to cancel that, I guess, because I don't have a drummer. That's when Ollie, the promoter for that festival, told me, well, Neudi knows all of your songs. Why don't you just ask him? And I was like, oh, wow, he is a really great drummer, isn't he? And so I asked him, and yeah, he was on board like that. And then after we did the Hammer of Doom, he did so well, it was like, Brian and I decided, Brian was like, you've got to ask him to come on and be our drummer.
Now, Mysterium starts a new trilogy, I feel, for Manilla Road, where it's their last 3 albums, and they kind of feel like they're retreading old ground, which many could look at as a bad thing, but to me it's almost like coming full circle. These albums could technically be considered useless, but to me they're still fucking quality Manilla Road albums. It's definitely the return of the classic sound, which isn't a bad thing if it's only a couple albums doing that. But Mysterium is definitely an excellent album all the way through. There's great riffs, Stand Your Ground is great, fucking Hermitage is great. There's so many good songs on here. My favorite is definitely Only the Brave, epic classic power metal. The most interesting song on here, though, is the title track, Mysterium, which is about one of Mark Shelton's very, very distant relatives that was an explorer, and him and his entire crew got lost on their voyage.
With compass and all, we set out across the lands to seek Australia's truth for science and for man.
Now, distribution for Manilla Road at this time was very, very good. A lot of the underground really started to remember who these guys were again. A lot of labels were distributing their shit all over the place. They're doing live shows all the time. In fact, they were even headlining shows on many occasions. Then we move on to their very lengthy, only double album, The Blessed Curse. first half of the album is endless crushing riffs, as usual, but then the second half gets a little bit more melodic and different for them, very spacey. There's even lengthy instrumental sections of acoustics. Very weird and very different. I know it's one of Mark's favorite albums before he died. Not only do you have a lot of these pretty melodic songs, but you have an epic song on here that ends it, but kind of doesn't on the album. There's a song called All Hallows Eve on here that was written way back in the early 80s, and they have that version in the second half. Then they also have the re-recorded 2014 version of it.
Whose idea was it to have Rick Fisher back in the studio to re-record?
It was actually Noemi's idea to have that happen because we found this, we found this plethora of tapes and stuff that had been in our archives and hidden away in my basement or my garage and stuff like this. And when he was over at the studio one time with us, we just, found all this stuff, and he took a bunch of it back home with him and started going through it. And he sent me these cuts, that he'd found. And when I heard All Hallows Eve, I was like, oh my God, I thought this song was lost forever, and he wanted to put it on the album. And I had the idea of, well, hey, what if we re-record this song, in sort of a nowadays version of what, it is. And then he came up with the idea, well, if you're going to do that, why don't you get Rick to play on it?
Yeah. I'm a fan.
Yeah, totally.
And so that's what happened.
Then the final lineup change. Josh left, and then Phil Ross came in to fill in as the bass player and learned all the songs for the tour very quickly, and then learned all the songs for the next album very quickly. Just a quick learner, and this cemented the final lineup going into the final album, To Kill a King. In retrospect, I'd probably say To Kill a King, this last album, is probably the best album they had done in a while. And I'd say it gets better the more you listen to it. Once again, it has that classic feel to it. But I would say, of doing the classic feel of these last couple albums, it's definitely the best of them. And there's still some cool different moments on there, especially with the title track, To Kill a King, which is a very weird song for them. And it's a very great, weird way to open the album. But from there, of course, you just have typical rifftastic songs from them, like The Arena and The Talisman, much better than Iron Maiden's The Talisman. And the best song, the best riffs, definitely the last song, Blood Island. And for this album, Mark did about half the vocals on it, so it was a great album, but honestly, it's kind of bittersweet to listen to it because it's the last one and what happened afterwards and whatnot. Now, during the summer of 2018, this year, they were doing a lengthy tour of Europe, and they were stopping in Germany doing the Headbangers Open Air, and it was a very lengthy set list for them. Great set list, by the way. There's people that have been uploading some of the footage on YouTube. They did pretty well. And it was really hot, man. It was the middle of the summer. They were all struggling to get through, especially Mark, but Mark kept soldiering on. But after the show, after the long set, the long hot set, Mark said this is the best show he's ever played, and then had a heart attack. Now, he was only 60, and from what we know, he didn't really have any heart conditions. He smoked a lot, but it's possible that he had a heart attack from just the straining of playing so many dates, playing such long shows in such grueling heat. It probably did take a heavy toll on him. I mean, just over the years of touring, he looked a lot older than he actually was. And you know what? He went out on his terms. Any metalhead, true metalhead, especially someone like him, would love to go out in a way where they just play what they felt was the best show they've ever done, struggling through it all the way just for the fans, and then die in peace, die painlessly. But can we also take a moment to acknowledge the bizarre irony that Mark the Shark died in the middle of Shark Week? Why does no one point that out? That's fucking weird. You know what? That's it for Manilla Road. Flawless discography, flawless victory. Mark will live on as a legend. That's the way you go out, ladies and gentlemen. Never stop making true metal and make as many albums as you can possibly do while being consistent and changing up the formula of it, and then go out while you're on top.
Many times I thought about quitting and hanging it up. And even now, the older I get, I mean, it's not easy to tour at my age. And especially now that we tour more and more every year. So, but I love it on the road. I love hanging out with our fans and our friends because, my goodness, they're the most gracious, respectful people that I've ever met in my life. And I mean, if I ended up just dying someplace on the road with my fans and friends, that's fine.
Dream of long ago and the hole in the sky with darkness